This is the first prototype of crafting that not showed off for Minecraft. How do we get from here to today, where we now have fully automated machines that can craft over 400 recipes now in the game? This is the ultimate timeline of everything Mojang changed and rejected from the crafting system. And it all starts with the B button. On January 8th of 2010, crafting was first added to Minecraft. But to call it crafting is really a stretch, since all that would happen back then is that if you pressed the B button, it would open up the crafting menu, and the only recipe available was crafting an arrow from a singular apple, which isn't the only weird arrow crafting recipe that we'd see, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Since on January 25th of 2010, we saw the very first mock-up for how crafting would be in the game. On Notch's blog on Tumblr, we saw this early version of what crafting could be in Minecraft. Back then, the idea was that you could use different tools like axes to right-click and then open up a carving menu and you interacted with a block of wood, which ultimately ended up pretty different from the workbenches that we'd see added on January 29th, which these workbenches were the original name for our crafting tables. And they also had a bit of a different texture, since if you looked at the bottom of the crafting table at this version, it had the open face oak log texture on the bottom. And with this workstation added in, you could no longer press B to open up the hotkey for the crafting menu. But we did now have crafting added into our inventory screens in survival. But what we didn't have yet was smelting, which is why on January 29th, we saw the option added for ground cooking, which is that back in this version of InDev, you could cook ores by throwing them into fire or lava. So for example, if you threw coal ore into fire or lava, you'd receive 1 to 3 coal. And just a day later on January 30th, we saw an ongoing trend of crafting recipes getting more expensive, considering that now our mineral blocks for iron, gold, and diamond used to be crafted from 4 ingots, but now went up to 9. And a few weeks later on February 12th, we saw this added recipe allowing you to craft chainmail. Sure enough, while it doesn't exist in the game today, you used to be able to craft chainmail using the fire item that you could only get from creative. And while this seemed like a placeholder, it would then be later removed, meaning that even now with chains added into the game, we still can't craft chainmail. But on February 19th, we were able to craft ourselves furnaces, which with this added meant that we no longer had the ground cooking system. And while nowadays we can use something as strange as dried kelp and carpets to cook up our fuel, back then it was only 3 different fuel types: sticks, planks, and coal. On July 19th of 2010, we saw cloth armor change to leather armor. Since when it was first added in, cloth was actually how we crafted our armor set that we're used to, but it just looked the same as our regular leather armor, and cloth being the original name for wool before it was changed, which when you look back at it, I think wool armor would have made a lot more sense for it being dyed. And later in July, we saw our arrow recipe change. That's why we no longer crafted them using apples. The old recipe after that was pretty expensive, requiring iron ingots instead of flint, which even after it's changed, a lot of people still find too expensive. I'll just trade with a Fletcher, thanks. At the start of 2011, our workbenches were finally renamed into crafting tables, and we're also now into Minecraft beta versions. And in that same Minecraft beta version, we saw shapeless crafting added to the game, which is that you could craft things without actually needing a specific recipe, just the same number of items within the recipe table. And the way that we would do this was by crafting different dyes and dyeing the different items as well. It'd be too annoying to make sure we had to place them in the right spots for it to work. In beta 1.6 test build, crafting got a lot faster for Minecraft, since now we could shift click and use that as a shortcut to craft up faster, allowing us to instantly have a maximum amount of crafts in the inventory. On September 9th of 2011, crafting tables were finally able to spawn naturally within the villages, giving you a new way, albeit a rare way, to actually encounter these if you were stumbling across your world. On October 6th of 2011, we got brewing stands added in Minecraft, and along with it, we now had a unique crafting station for crafting up our potions. But this also meant the end of a different idea for potions, considering that originally potions were supposed to be crafted within the cauldron blocks, but that whole system was scrapped, and we wouldn't get potion cauldrons until later when those were added into Bedrock Edition. But there, you still don't brew in them, you only use them to store. One of the unforeseen features of older crafting station blocks was that they took forever to break, and before November 11th of 2011, breaking a furnace would take 5.5 seconds. So on a lot of old PvP servers, players would use these for forts, and since crafting tables didn't have an intended tool to break them, it would take quite a while just to get rid of one of these. But this changed in beta 1.9 pre-release 6, now giving us the mining speed that we're familiar with today. When golden apples were first added into the game, they originally were crafted from full golden blocks, but this was changed in version 1.1 on January 12th, 2012. And also in 2012, we got the Mattis crafting system added to Pocket Edition, which Mattis is an acronym. It stands for Minecraft Advanced Touch Technology Interface System, and it was a way for you to craft inside of a scrolling menu, not requiring you to craft up the things in a different recipe, but rather just needing enough of the material to make the item, which is a lot more similar to how crafting is in other games. On May 31st of 2012, we got Snapshot 12W22A, finally adding the ability for furnaces to give us experience, which also inadvertently gave us a new way of experience farming as well, as essentially a furnace could work as an XP battery. And when we had things like zero-tick farms to allow us to instantly smelt up bamboo, that temporarily made these furnaces into a real powerhouse for XP. On August 23rd of 2012, we can now dye our leather armor, which just with that simple change inadvertently allowed for 5,713,438 different color recipes, because not only could we just craft these into our 16 different colors, but we could also have gradients between the different colors, each a result of how much dye you added onto the leather armor. And now with the ability to add in different smithing templates onto these dyed leather pieces of armor, there's millions more different opportunities that we can change around here. On October 11th of 2012, anvils were added to the game, and along with it, we finally had a dedicated place for repairing our tools. And most importantly, if you repaired them here, you kept their enchantments intact. Since before, if you took two different tools and you repaired them together in the crafting table, that would give you more durability, but you'd lose the enchantments in the process. One of our first steps towards any kind of automatic crafting was the hopper plus furnace combo, which we saw enter the game on January 10th of 2013. Now, hoppers already existed, but this update made it so that hoppers could only pull from the furnace's output. So having hoppers at different locations on the furnace meant that we could take out what we needed and put in the rest. And on January 30th of 2013, we got the stone cutter, but it didn't look like how we're familiar with it. Rather, this was the old stone cutter that was only seen in Pocket Edition Alpha, and it looked a lot more like a furnace, which is funny, because that's one of the few stone type blocks that it actually couldn't craft, as well as itself or any kind of stone tools. And later that year in June, our golden apples got another new crafting recipe, since now the way to craft our golden apples required golden ingots instead of the nuggets to craft. And unfortunately, this is also the time where we saw the enchanted golden apple crafting recipe disappear, meaning the notch apple went from being one of the most expensive items to one of the rarest. Did you know you used to be able to craft cocoa beans? Well, on Pocket Edition, you couldn't exactly find these things, so they added it in the alpha version 0.8 that you could craft them in with 3 different dye options. So you'd have your choice of orange, yellow, or red dye, as well as an ink sac. Which is definitely weird to see, but I guess if you mixed all those colors, you probably would get brown dye. It just makes more sense when it's brown dye and not cocoa beans. I'd rather not eat a cookie made with an ink sac. On June 18th of 2014, we lost the crafting recipe for chainmail. And the reason was that because of the flattening, we lost the item for fire. And as of this day, there's still no official way to craft chainmail, even if we do have 2 kinds of chains in the game now. In Snapshot 14W30A, we got new fixed recipes. And what's the difference between a fixed recipe and a shaped crafting recipe? Well, shaped crafting recipes can be flipped. So shapeless would be flint and steel, you can craft that anywhere in the crafting recipe. And then a fixed recipe was something like the old banner pattern recipes, which at this point could be flipped at all. During a live stream on October 7th of 2015, Mojang very first answered when we would be getting a recipe book added to Minecraft.
If classic crafting gets implemented in 0.13, would there be an option for Mattis crafting too?
So it's the recipe book, basically.
Yeah, okay. We are debating it, but I would guess so, yes.
But we'd still have to wait nearly 2 years before it actually came to the game. But just a week after that live stream, they did make a change to our brewing stands. Since in Snapshot 15W42A, brewing stands now require fuel. And this is because you could find a brewing stand inside of the cleric's house in a village, so if you didn't need any blaze powder, you could completely bypass this step. Though I think needing to go and get a reliable source of netherwort from the fortresses is already justification enough to go and do this. In the version 0.13 Pocket Edition Alpha build, Mojang removed the old stone cutter, and now all of the recipes they would make in that stone cutter block were moved over to the crafting table. And while you could still get the old stone cutter in the creative mode menu, it was just meant as a decorative block. And then on March 30th of 2017, the recipe book was finally added to Minecraft, giving us a way to easily craft recipes and to remember the ones we might have forgotten. But in that same update with the recipe book, we also got the ability to craft even less, thanks to this game rule, do limited crafting, which is meant as a game rule so that map makers can restrict access to certain recipes. And when you combine this with the recipe book creative item, then you can make a way where a player could play your map and then restrict certain recipes naturally, only to gain them by using this book, which is something pretty cool and something I still don't see used much to this day. And then in Snapshot 17W48A, we now have the ability to add our own custom data pack recipes for crafting, which is basically the whole basis for a lot of the vanilla tweaks changes. Some of those recipes fit in so well, I forget which ones are vanilla and which ones aren't. And then just one snapshot later, item tags and recipes were changed as well. And what did this mean? Well, now that the items all fall under a tag list, it meant that our recipes could be simplified down to one file. So you'd only have to make one recipe if you wanted to include wooden planks, as opposed to one crafting recipe each for each different wooden plank. In Snapshot 18W48A, we got the grindstones added in, which gave us a workstation to repair our tools without costing any XP. And for a brief time, it also let us stack up our enchanted books like so. If you put 2 cursed books in, you could shift click out a stack of 2 from this output. And rounding out 2018, in December of that year, we got the blast furnaces and the smokers in 18W50A, giving us a new kind of specialization to our furnace blocks, since we could smelt at 2 times the speed for any of their specific item types. But when the smoker was first added in, it had a pixel placed in the wrong part of the texture, ruining its rotational symmetry, until that was fixed in a later update. As of Snapshot 19W02A, we had a way to craft ourselves charcoal. It would just take a few steps, since because this update added in the campfire, if we were to craft one of those up in a crafting table, then when we place it down, we could break it and still get the charcoal to drop from the logs that we put into it, giving us a roundabout way of not having to smelt for the stuff. For the first update of 2019, we saw map making change from the crafting table to the cartography table. And with that came the exclusive recipe to lock our maps in the cartography table, just by adding a glass pane in the crafting slot. And just a week later on January 16th, we got the composter, allowing us the ability to craft down any plant or food item into bone meal. And then just another week after that, we got the stone cutting discounts added to Java. Since now not only do we have the stone cutter to craft up our stone related items, but we could also craft our stairs even better, since it would only cost 1 block for 1 stair as opposed to 1.5 before. If you've ever played old versions, you'll surely miss this feature, but it's only as recent as Snapshot 19W34A in August 22nd of 2019 that we're able to shift click into the 3x3 grid. Before, it just wouldn't register those slots as any kind of container, making it a lot slower. While the smithing table was added before March 4th of 2020, it was only on this update that it finally got functionality. Oh, and when it was first added, the smithing table originally had this texture, looking a lot more like a crafting table Mark II than anything that we got later in the game. But when it first got its functionality, it wasn't all that useful, considering the only purpose for it was to upgrade our diamond tools and a netherite using 1 ingot. But on January 24th of 2023, we got a whole overhaul to our smithing table, since now you would see this armor stand visualizing inside of the smithing table overlay, because we could combine our different armors with armor trims, which also unfortunately meant that we had to upgrade our netherite using a netherite upgrade template as opposed to how we used to do it before. This whole update also was a way to check how many diamonds you had, because just duplicating any one of these templates costs 7 diamonds a piece. Brutally expensive. And on May 25th of that year, we finally got this changed to bedrock. Since before preview 1.20.10.20, you could only craft bedrock boats using an oak shovel, but now they were brought up to Java parity, not needing this anymore. Which is good that it didn't go the other way, because this change wasn't an experiment for Java during the development of 1.9 before it was ultimately removed. And then perhaps the single largest change to crafting since the game's introduction was when Mojang showed off the crafter block, a fully automatic way to craft up any of our recipes, making our farm storage a lot more compact, if not also a little confusing on how to use one of these things. And with that, folks, YouTube thinks that you might like this video, so see if they're right and have a good one, alright?